time in this country, a long time ago, when reading wasn't just for fags, and neither was writing. People wrote books and movies that had stories, so you cared whose ass it was and why it was farting, and I believe that time can come again.
Hello, and welcome back to the Think Liberty podcast. This is episode 70. I'm Caitlin, your host, and joining me this week is Matthew McGowan. How are you, buddy?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I had a long weekend. We had the Libertarian Party in Minnesota State Convention this weekend.
Oh, nice. How was that?
I effectively quit my position.
Nice.
I had a sick kid the night before, so I was up all night. Like, I went to the convention late because I was up all night, and I missed the whole business portion, so I couldn't have even ran for anything if I wanted to, but that wasn't the plan. So it was good to just go and hang out and have fun and see all the speakers. Alex Merced was there.
Cool. Yeah, we have our state conference coming up at the end of the month, and I actually resigned all of my official positions last month, but still planning on going up there with our good buddy Josh, and it'll be good to see everybody.
Yeah, good for you, man. It is pretty liberating, kind of quitting all that stuff and doing your own thing. It is.
Most definitely. There's so many ways that we can work to achieve liberty, and I kind of like what we do here.
Yeah, I feel like we're a lot more effective working in the independent media market. So.
Same.
Well, this week, let's just get right into it. We're going to be talking about the prison system, alternatives and processes for reform. So $28,000 a year is what we pay every year per inmate in prison of taxpayer money. That's just astounding, considering that we have over 7 million Americans either incarcerated or in the correctional system in one way or another, either through probation, parole, or other. It's about 1 in 35. So Insane. 1 in 35 Americans is under the correctional system somehow.
Wow. Land of the free.
Yeah, no shit. The U.S. has 25% of the world's prison population, despite being only 5% of the world's population. Crime rates have been cut in half since their peak in 1991, but yet the prison population has doubled, and it's quadrupled since 1980. I'll give you two guesses why.
I give up.
The drug war.
Oh,
yep.
No doubt.
Since 1980, that was, right around when they ramped things up, and since 1980, we've quadrupled our prison population due to nonviolent drug crime. So we have this massive prison industrial complex within the U.S. What do you think are some things that should be done to reduce the incarceration rates across the country?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head talking about the drug war. I mean, there's no finer example of a victimless crime than someone choosing to use drugs in the privacy of their own home and be incarcerated for it. I don't even have words. The changes that would be possible just by peeling that back alone would definitely put an end to we certainly wouldn't be 25% of the world's prison population. I'll say that.
Yeah, no kidding. And another one is getting rid of victimless crimes, especially considering in 2016, there was an estimated 1.7 million violent crimes committed. But 10.7 million arrests were made, ranging from murder to traffic violations. So the majority of arrests and incarcerations are for nonviolent, victimless crimes. That is just insane to me.
Yep.
It's like 9/10 of all of the incarcerated people for nonviolent crimes.
Well, again, I know that there's various schools of thought among libertarians when it comes to state versus private prisons. But, a lot of people do believe, and I think there's merit to it, that the proliferation of private prisons has incentivized these companies to lobby for stricter laws. And as a result, we're locking people up for things that should at best be a fine.
That's another kind of segue I wanted to get into is the private prisons. Now, a key part of libertarian philosophy is privatization of all the things. The private market can regulate itself better. It can provide alternatives. It's the way to go is privatizing government programs. This is the one area I don't believe libertarian philosophy really jives with. Maybe because it's already a government institution, but it just doesn't work. The incentive structure works against the people it's supposed to serve. So
absolutely.
They've actually had cases of judges, I believe it was in Arizona, selling juveniles and kids to private prisons. They would pay off judges to get more conviction rates for juveniles to fill up these private prisons. And it ended up being several thousand kids over the span of 10 years getting funneled into prisons when alternative methods of punishment, I guess, would have sufficed a lot better. It was usually children of color, like Black kids, Hispanic kids, poor kids, because they didn't have the money to fight back.
Right. And that's just the one judge that got caught.
Yeah, just the one guy.
Yep.
And you have to think of how many other judges are there out there who are doing this for private prisons. And that's so antithetical to, liberty and freedom and all of the things we wax poetic about as libertarians. This is just the one thing that doesn't fall in line with our privatization theory. So I do think prisons should be, if they're going to exist in our society and they're going to be an integral part of criminal justice, they need to not have that profit motive behind them.
Amen. We should be looking to reduce the amount of them, certainly not adding them. Unfortunately, it has to start with state capitals and localities. It's legislating things that really shouldn't be crimes, at least at the level of locking people up. You hit the nail on the head with these types of laws tend to target the poor, the people without the money to fight back. And it just creates a vicious cycle of crime. And we see it every day, looking at the problem and deciding how we can peel away the laws that are putting people in these cycles of dependency. We add more laws to fight crime and to make things safer. And we just continue the cycle.
Mm-hmm. And private prisons also are a $1 billion industry. In 2015, they hit $1.79 billion in revenue. The following year, they were at almost $2 billion. And you look at the laws that were passed in between, they amped up the drug war in this period of time. So you can see, just following the money, that the more prisoners you have, the more money you're making on it. It just doesn't work. So aside from ending the drug war, which I think is one of the most important things that we can talk about as libertarians, because it affects everybody, whether they think so or not, whether they're drug users, whether they're business owners, broken families that have their father figure or their mother figure in prison over stupid, nonviolent crimes. It literally does affect everybody. So that is the biggest thing we can do to help curb the prison population. But another aspect of this, ending the drug war and getting rid of victimless crimes, that's kind of the utopian response to this. But it doesn't really address what we can do right now. Right. Realistic measures that we can push for reform that will affect people right now. As we all know, prison sentencing can be a vicious cycle for generations, causing financial strife within families, which is, one of the main causes behind crime rates. If you change the sentencing practices to cut prison and jail time out of the equation, you can stop that cycle. You can keep families from going under. You can keep that cycle from repeating from generation to generation and creating more criminals out of necessity, like, petty theft or selling drugs or any of these other I wouldn't say theft is a victimless crime, but it's nonviolent at least.
Right.
So some sentencing alternatives would be probation. Instead of $28,000 a year that we're spending on inmates, it's cost about $4,000 to $5,000 a year of taxpayer dollars. It keeps the offender in the community working, doing community service, contributing to the economy. Treatment or rehabilitation can be terms of the probation depending on the offense. Another one would be house arrest or electronic monitoring. That's about $6,000 a year. It can be used for more serious offenses, theft or vandalism or maybe some more serious stuff, but it does keep families intact. And that's an important aspect that a lot of people gloss over when they talk about locking people up. It's like, well, you do the crime, you do the time, but you don't think about the offender's family. You don't think about their kids at home who now don't have a dad. Yes, it was his fault. He did the crime, but it creates a very difficult psychological situation with children and partners. It can create more crime down the line for not having that father figure in their life.
Well, and not only that, but, unfortunately, the stigma that sometimes comes with having served in prison, I think by and large, employers are getting a lot better at giving folks a second chance, but it's still a hindrance to finding an actual job. So what happens is, a lot of these folks, they go right back to crime because it's all they got. So if we can look at some of these alternatives to keep them out of prison, not only keep them in the community doing community service or serving under house arrest, but keeping that prison term off their record, you're definitely setting up the chances for them not to repeat.
Exactly. And over 40% of all people leaving prison will reoffend and be back in prison within 3 years. Yeah.
When you make it impossible to find a job because of that record,
exactly.
That's going to send them right back.
Yeah, I think it should definitely be used as a last resort kind of thing, or for, violent criminals, which, going back to the statistics, is less than 2 million a year.
Right. Well, and this is an area that, the private sector has, again, I think that I see it in my job every day. Employers are loosening those regulations a bit. They're giving folks a chance, but, it's still a problem. So this is definitely something that would help cut that 40% reoffense.
Definitely. And the more things you have on your record, the harder it is to get a job, and the more financial strife you put on your family or your loved ones. And I feel
taxpayers.
Yes, the taxpayers, of course.
From the practical point of view and the libertarian small government point of view, there's definitely incentive to reduce that.
Absolutely. So another one I found was fines or restitution. We all know about fines and having to pay alongside maybe a jail sentence or a probation. I think all of us have gotten a traffic ticket, so we're all pretty familiar with fines. But doing research for this episode, I found 2 different types of fines, which I found really interesting. One being what they call a tariff fine, which are predetermined fine amounts for particular offenses, such as a first offense DUI being a $500 fine, things like that, the things we're familiar with. Mm-hmm. These don't take into account income or ability to pay. But the other, which I think is a better way to work with the public, is called day fines. They're not a flat amount, but are based on the seriousness of the crime and offenders' daily income. So wealthier offenders can pay more and pay an amount that is a meaningful loss of income, while those with lower incomes pay an amount they can afford and avoid jail.
Well, that would definitely serve to put the wealthier in the crosshairs for sure. I would imagine that the targeting would change, so to speak.
Yeah, I do like the working with people based on their income, because some of these fines are just outrageous and they're almost impossible to pay. So poor people end up having to go to jail to forego the fine, which leads back to all the other issues with going to jail instead of other meaningful ways of paying their debt to society.
Yeah,
but
I would definitely
can see that there's unintended consequences here with targeting more wealthy people.
Not that, hey, a lot of wealthier people have gotten away with shit for a long time, so I don't want to sound like I'm defending the poor wealthy folks, but I do think it would just shift the problem of policing for profit from one constituency to another. It definitely wouldn't stop it.
Definitely. I mean, there's going to be a lot of unintended consequences for a lot of things. I mean, especially, it's a state agency. They don't exactly have our best interest at heart ever.
Right.
But maybe working with inner city or lower income areas, this could be kind of a standard for those precincts. I think that would be better for a lot of these communities.
It would give the judges the discretion to waive them as well and take into account people's situations. I definitely think that we have to shift the focus away from the profit aspect of it.
Absolutely. Giving judges more leeway with sentencing, doing away with mandatory minimums, doing away with the profit aspect of it. I think that would go a long way to helping communities come together and solve these problems themselves.
Right. And seeking the alternatives. I mean, I've heard of judges doing some creative things that maybe can help a lot of these offenders to get over what's causing them to reoffend. outside of the vicious cycle we talked about before.
So community service is another one. It keeps the offender in the public while, quote unquote, paying their debt to society, so to speak. Currently, community service isn't available in federal court as a standalone sentence, but that can be changed if we lobby for it. So going back to what can we do to get prison and jail off the table in a lot of these circumstances, we can push for, community service to become a federal sentence instead of just a state and locality sentence.
Right.
Keep people out of jail. Because prison and jail is a one-size-fits-all, I guess, cure or attempt at a cure for much larger problem. You have underlying issues that lead to crime. You have
Right.
a lot of things that are illegal, the victimless crime, stuff like that. Just throwing everybody in prison isn't curing anything. It's not fixing anything. You have a 40% recidivism rate. It's clearly not doing the job well. So we have to really rethink the way we go about punishment for criminal behavior or offenses such as this. And mental health is another underlying factor in this. But one thing that has been introduced is mental health courts. So mental health courts, like drug courts, are specialized courts that place offenders suffering from mental illness, mental disabilities, drug dependency, or serious personality disorders in a court-supervised, community-based mental health treatment program. Court and community supervision is combined with inpatient or outpatient professional mental health treatment. Offenders receive rewards for compliance with supervision conditions and are disciplined for noncompliance. They're also linked to housing, healthcare, and life skills training resources that help prevent relapse and promote their recovery. Often, offenders must plead guilty first to charges before being diverted to mental health court, but that's also something that, with enough lobbying or changing that legislation, that we could change. Take out that guilty plea requirement. So even if they plead innocent and are found guilty, that they can still take advantage of these resources. Because I don't like having guilty pleas be a requirement for a lesser sentence.
Right. And that's an area I've said for years, if they have to take my money from me, this is an area where I'm okay with it being spent and with them spending more, honestly. I think if we could peel back the amount of people that we lock up for dumb shit like smoking weed or, other victimless crimes, prostitution, and divert that money into mental health for a lot of these people who can't escape the system to get help, I think we would save so much money in the end that it's one of the areas where I think if we're going to have menarchy, that's an area where I'm fine with us spending. I think that's the key to it all, really.
Well, exactly. And a lot of these issues, it's much bigger than it seems on its face. When you fix the healthcare system and you privatize a lot of the healthcare system, mental health availability, it'll be much more largely available to those who can't afford it.
Absolutely.
Driving the prices down. So that's one thing that will contribute to, helping the mental health crisis that is pretty rampant within the prison system, pretty rampant within the causes for crime itself. You have a lot of undiagnosed mental health. I wouldn't say a vast majority, but a large percentage of the homeless population, people who are already prone to crime because of their socioeconomic situation, they also have mental health problems. So getting these people the help they need in any way possible, I think, is something we should all strive for, whether it's taxpayer funded or whether it's privately funded through charity or reforming the healthcare system itself. But these mental health courts are a good alternative for when you know that mental health is a factor in the criminal behavior to begin with. It keeps people out of the prison system, which is not really good for people with mental health problems.
No, and I think that's where a lot of them derive from. You have people who generations who have spent time in prison. I mean, I have it in my own family. And, a lot of these folks don't necessarily learn the skills to cope growing up in those types of environments. And when they get to adulthood, they don't know how to deal. And they go down the spiral that gets them returning to prison. And I think if we can make it available to help some of those folks get those coping skills, I think a lot of folks who suffer with mental health issues, they're not, it's not something they can't overcome. They need the assistance that's an area where, I would love to see the private sector step up. I would be fine with diverting the money we waste on all kinds of other shit to shit like that.
Or even the money we waste on putting them in prison. All of this stuff is cheaper than just putting them in a cell.
Amen. I would
any
think
of
that
these are tax cuts for us.
I would think there's a large segment of that population that would benefit from a couple of weeks in a mental facility. I've seen it. I've done a lot of work, volunteer work with the VA and worked with homeless veterans, and I've seen people who have actually been able to get the help and get out of it.
Yeah.
That's definitely an issue. We could change the whole cycle
Sometimes
of poverty
it just
and dependency
takes
in
one
this country.
person intervening at the right moment to stop that cycle. Because it's a vicious cycle of non-treatment for mental health issues, and then they get put in prison for a crime they've committed, and the mental health gets worse. Then they are part of that 40% recidivism rate, and it just goes on and on and on. And sometimes that's all it takes, is someone to step in and be like, hey, you need help. Let me help you.
That's just it. The current system focuses on punishment and punishment exclusively. There's got to be an avenue for rehabilitation for the people it would help. That's not everybody. I'm not saying every cold-blooded murderer's just a poor, misunderstood soul, but there are a lot of people who are there through shit that's beyond their control. And that's the kind of people that, if the system was a little more focused on rehabilitation and a little less on saying, hey, we're going to punish criminals and we're going to be hard asses and we're going to fight crime and we're going to do this, that, and the other, this is a problem that we could erase.
Absolutely. Another one is restorative justice. And this kind of gets into that remediating factor of alternatives. So restorative justice is a holistic sentencing process focused on repairing harm and bringing healing to all of those who are impacted by a crime, including the offender. Representatives of the justice system, victims, offenders, and community members are involved and achieve these goals through sentencing circles, victim restitution, victim offender mediation, and formalized community service programs. Sentencing circles occur when the victim, offender, community members, and criminal justice officials meet and jointly agree on a sentence that repairs the harm the offender caused. Victim offender mediation allows the offender and victim to meet and exchange apologies and forgiveness for the crime committed. Restorative justice practices can be used alone or as a condition of a sentence of probation. I love this option because it's very close to the libertarian answer of private arbitration. In lieu of federal court systems, they always talk about how private arbitration will be the way to go. This is very similar to that.
Absolutely. Making this an option for any type of crime that involves, an actual victim. I see nothing but benefit. It doesn't necessarily have to be the route they go, but if they're willing to go it. And
I think it can help with a lot of things. Like, it's funny, actually, a few weeks ago, we had our snowblower stolen out of our yard. And I didn't even know until a couple of days later when the cops were banging on my door, like, hey, are you missing your snowblower? It's like, oh, I guess I am. But
Wow.
this is the kind of thing that would have been really helpful in our case because, the guy stole our snowblower and that's shitty. Like, he shouldn't have stolen anything. But I think sitting down with him and being like, hey, dude, you stole our fucking snowblower. Like, that's not cool.
Yeah, what the fuck?
Like,
Right.
maybe we can work out something so where you don't have to go to jail. Because sending the guy to jail for 3 years is not really something that I see as restorative for him. That's not going to make
Right.
him be a better person. That just gets him off the streets for 3 years for stealing a snowblower. That's just ridiculous. So these kind of options can be really helpful in these situations where, yes, there is a victim, but nobody was hurt. Or even if someone was hurt, if it was like a hit and run and nobody died, that kind of thing, where people are just, hurt. I think this could be a really great option for that because it gets everybody involved. You have your community members there, the victims, the offenders, the justice system, everybody's there and they all come to the table with an attitude. It's a different attitude when you have this as when you have prison and jail. Like, it's a very healing attitude. Like, let's fix this. Let's address the root cause. Let's find out what we can do to help all parties involved. And that's the attitude we need to bring to sentencing and the justice system in general. And I think we'd get a lot farther.
No doubt.
Now, another one, which I'm not really a fan of it, but it is an alternative that I would definitely take over jail. Boot camp. Now, it's not used on the federal level at all, and it's very rarely used in state courts. But this option, while not ideal, could make a comeback and be used in cases involving youth crimes. Instead of putting teenagers and young adults in jail or juvenile detention and screwing up their life from the get-go, boot camp could be used as a second chance. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
This is another one that, I mean, if they have to do something, I don't necessarily have a problem with this. You know, honestly, one of the things that got me on the right path was spending a couple months in boot camp in the Army. And I could see situations. I knew people who took the military route to avoid prison when I was in. And I know the positive life. I think, again, you know, you get people, especially youngsters, who don't have that family unit, don't have that cohesion, do not have that positive influence in their life. I've seen examples where this type of environment can impact their life. So I'm open to that. I don't know how good it is with adults. And I think that this is one where if you have inner city kids that the families don't necessarily have to share the burden of the cost on, because I think if you can intercede in their lives and get them on the right path early enough, there's potential for that to be impactful in a positive way.
Right. And I see it being used in maybe like juvenile assault cases or
petty crimes.
Yeah, very petty stuff that you know that this kid is not a bad kid, but they do kind of need their ass kicked. Figuratively, not literally.
Yeah. No, I know exactly what you mean, and it's true. I think that's the way that it can have that positive impact. It can give them that theoretical kick in the ass.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's definitely better than jail.
Yeah. Putting a child whose brain is still developing in jail, I don't see how there can be any positive impact to that whatsoever, unless they're a murderer or a rapist. Like, kids do not belong in jail, no matter what.
Yeah, and I mean, we're definitely not talking about the extreme cases here. Kids who are committing crimes, even if the drug war doesn't end tomorrow and they're still arresting people for selling drugs, I mean, that would be an alternative for a kid selling drugs to try to make ends meet, to give him an out before he gets lost in the cycle of the system.
Exactly.
I think it's an absolute positive, or it has the potential to be a positive. I've wanted to send my kids a time or two, so that might help them.
I was threatened with it quite a few times growing up.
Oh my God, so was I. Repeatedly.
Yeah, I
really
saw
wasn't
the pamphlets
even that
bad
and everything.
of a kid, but I got threatened with it constantly. You know, I'd sneak out and go to a party or something, and then there'd be a boot camp pamphlet on my bed the next day. Like, oh shit.
Same. No shit.
Another one is public humiliation. Now, I didn't even know this existed as an existing sentencing in the U.S., but it does. It's used very rarely and usually for low-level misdemeanors. For example, a court ordered a convicted mail thief to stand outside a post office for a total of 100 hours wearing a sign that said, "I am a mail thief. This is my punishment." Yeah. Public shaming is intended to rehabilitate the offender and discourage him from reoffending. And I love this. It would be so humiliating that I don't think that they would do it again.
Yeah, I get it. I'm sure there's definitely crimes where it might even be an appropriate answer. You know, this might be another one for kids that to embarrass them into not being morons. I don't know. Yeah. I'm mixed on the whole public shaming thing.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely a deterrent when you talk about privatizing or ending state power on justice. It's definitely going to be one of the routes that people choose to take, whether it be putting people in a database when they're accused of crimes or have been quote unquote convicted of crimes, putting them in a database that's available to all future employers or anyone who wants to access it. And so they can see these crimes that have been committed and say, hey, I don't want to associate with you. I see this as kind of in that same category.
I don't know. I see this as being something that has a high potential to be misused. I read a story this weekend. I don't remember what exactly it was from, but it was at a basketball game or something like that. At halftime, they flashed up on the screen all these people who were in arrears of their taxes, to publicly humiliate them. And it may have been a different crime, but for some reason I want to say that's what it is. But that's the way that I could see it being used. I don't know. Maybe in individual cases where you
or it could be offered as a choice.
Discretion. Yeah.
Maybe that could be it. Like either 1 year probation or public humiliation or some other kind of option where you give the offender a choice. Maybe
10 days in jail, or you can stand out there with the sign. That would definitely. I like the alternatives. I like presenting the alternatives.
Absolutely. And there's so many alternatives out there that it almost makes you wonder why jail and prison is always the go-to, even in these very small cases, the local cases, the state cases where private prisons aren't really a factor. So that profit motive isn't a huge factor in these. It makes you wonder what needs to be done to change the thinking of those within our justice system. What's it going to take to make that shift from prison and jail as the number one answer to this, these plethora of options that we have?
Well, I think that it's going to take a shift in legislation. And in order for that to happen, it's going to take we as a populace to stop letting politicians scare us into passing all these ridiculous laws to keep us safe. One thing that politicians do exceptionally well is scare the shit out of people and the next boogeyman around the corner, be it ISIS, be it, crime rampant in your town and this, that, and the other. A lot of times the government overblows problems so they can come up with solutions. And I think that the prison system and the justice system is exhibit A in that. It's going to take a lessening of legislation, a lessening of laws. There needs to be less laws to enforce. There needs to be less reasons to put people in prison if we're ever going to start to peel away from that mentality and more toward actual rehabilitation for the people who commit genuine crimes.
Right. We have to do something to get that 10.7 million arrests each year down to the 1.7 million violent crimes. Like, we have to make that even. Like, violent crime should be the reason people get arrested, not a broken taillight, not going 20 over on the freeway. Just
not paying your taxes.
Things. Exactly, not paying your taxes.
We're going to spend taxes because you didn't pay your taxes.
Right, which totally makes sense. Let's spend $28,000 a year because this person didn't pay their $3,000 tax bill. Right. Yeah, let's do it. So
or you're selling drugs because you can't make ends meet. Here, I'm going to slap you with a $500 fine that you can't afford either. And
if you don't pay it, we're putting you in jail for 2 years.
Right.
And then it's going to be impossible to get a job after those 2 years. So good luck. So we do have to do something about our 25% of the world's prison population that we have here in the U.S. Outside of getting rid of those victimless crimes, outside of ending the drug war, which are the two most obvious things, at least as libertarians, that we see that can be done. But legislation takes forever. In the meantime, we can push for jury nullification, which is something I think every libertarian has hit on at one point. If you're in a jury, you can convince the jury, if they don't believe that the crime the accused is being accused of is a crime or should be a crime, you can rule them innocent, whether they did it or not. And that's something we should be pushing for. That's something that can be done right now, that can affect lives today and already affects lives everywhere. More people need to be aware of jury nullification. They need to be aware of sentencing alternatives because that can affect people's lives right now. We can't wait 2 to 5 years or however long it takes to get the right people in office and the right legislation passed or the right stuff repealed to start seeing these effects. We have to change the system now. And I think that's mostly just an educational campaign that we need to do. Like, we need to educate people who are on juries. We need to educate the general public, educate the voters, educate politicians politicians are us. They're assholes most of the time, and they're usually full of shit. But if we go to our state capitals and we talk to people who are making these justice system reforms or making legislation, we have to inform them of these things. We have to say, look, there are alternatives to prison and jail. We should be pushing these. You should be pushing these down the line to, your court systems and offering these as alternatives instead of jail and prison if you want the crime rate to go down even further. So that's what we have to do as libertarians, as anybody who believes that our prison population is too high and that it is ruining lives across the country. That's what we have to do. So in the show notes, I'm going to include 2 really informative articles that I found when I was doing research. One is on private prisons, and it's full of data from the last 10, 20 years on, prison and crime, and it's got a bunch of stuff on the war on drugs. And then another one on sentencing alternatives. And this is from Families Against Mandatory Minimums. They have a ton of educational stuff on their website about this as well. So if you want to look into this even more, we will give you the resources. Is there anything you wanted to add before we go?
I would second your point on jury nullification. I think the Libertarian Party, if any of the folks in charge of marketing and outreach are listening, that would be a hell of a subject. I think it was your convention this weekend. Somebody put a post up of a flyer that you guys had that kind of informed people of their rights and how they should interact with police officers. I think making one of those for people who are going to do jury duty would be a great idea as well. That's an excellent point.
Before we go, we just want to remind our listeners to check out Think Liberty on all social media platforms. Just search Think Liberty on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and any other platforms you use. And as always, our website is think-liberty.com. You can find our shop on there with tons of original designs. And before you're done listening, subscribe to the Think Liberty Podcast Network for almost daily uploads of new shows. Leave us a review and tell a friend. I appreciate everyone's time this week, and whether you like it or not, we'll probably be back.